What person got a teen pregnancy that really surprised you? My sister Naomi got pregnant at 16, and nobody in our family believed her. Not because she was lying, but because our parents had spent her entire pregnancy insisting she was just gaining weight from stress eating. They refused to take her to a doctor even when her stomach swelled so large she couldn't fit into any of her clothes. They told relatives she was going through a difficult phase and needed privacy. They homeschooled her starting in January to keep neighbors from seeing her condition. And when she finally went into labor on a spring afternoon while our parents were at work, I was the only person there to help her. I was 14 at the time, completely unprepared for what happened that day. Naomi had been complaining about back pain all morning, lying on the couch with her hand pressed against her enormous belly. Our parents had left hours earlier for their jobs and wouldn't be home until after 6. Around noon, Naomi's face went white and she doubled over, clutching her stomach and making sounds I'd never heard before. Deep groans that came from somewhere primal and terrifying. I asked if she was okay, and she just shook her head, tears streaming down her face, telling me something was wrong and she needed help right now. I grabbed my phone to call our parents, but Naomi stopped me, her hand clamping around my wrist with surprising strength. She said they wouldn't believe her, that they'd just yell at her for being dramatic like they always did. She was right. Our parents had spent months denying reality, treating Naomi's obvious pregnancy like it was some kind of elaborate attention-seeking scheme. They'd accused her of stuffing pillows under her shirt, of lying to get sympathy, of trying to embarrass the family with ridiculous claims. No matter how much evidence accumulated, they simply refused to acknowledge what was happening. When Naomi's water broke, soaking through her sweatpants and onto the couch cushions, I understood this was really happening and I had no idea what to do. I'd seen births on television shows, but that didn't prepare me for the reality of my teenage sister screaming in pain, begging me to help her get to the bathroom because she felt like she needed to push. I helped her walk the 15 feet to the bathroom, supporting her weight as she waddled with her legs spread wide, fluid dripping down her thighs with every step. She collapsed onto the bathroom floor, unable to make it to the toilet, and that's where she stayed for the next 2 hours. I called 911 3 times during those 2 hours. The first time, I explained my sister was in labor and needed an ambulance immediately. The dispatcher asked routine questions about her age, her due date, how far apart the contractions were. When I said she was 16 and hadn't seen a doctor at all during the pregnancy, the dispatcher's tone changed. She asked why Naomi hadn't received prenatal care, and I didn't know how to explain that our parents had pretended none of this was happening. The dispatcher said an ambulance was on the way, but they were dealing with a major accident on the highway, and it might take 30 minutes or more. 30 minutes turned into an hour, then longer. I called back twice to ask where they were and got transferred between different people who all asked the same questions again. Meanwhile, Naomi was screaming so loud I was sure the neighbors would hear, but nobody came to check on us. She kept saying she couldn't do this, that something was wrong, that the baby was coming and she didn't know how to stop it. I knelt beside her on the bathroom floor, holding her hand while she squeezed hard enough to leave bruises, watching her face turn red and blotchy from pushing. The baby came fast once Naomi started pushing properly. 1 minute she was screaming that she couldn't do it, and the next minute there was a head crowning between her legs, dark hair matted and slick. I watched in frozen horror as my sister pushed again, and the entire baby slid out onto the bathroom floor in a rush of blood and fluid. The baby didn't cry immediately. It just lay there between Naomi's legs, skin grayish-blue and covered in white vernix, completely silent and still. I thought it was dead. Then the baby gasped and let out a weak cry that grew stronger with each breath. I grabbed towels from the cabinet and wrapped the baby up, not knowing what else to do. The umbilical cord was still attached, pulsing and thick, connecting my sister to this tiny, screaming creature she'd just pushed out of her body. Naomi was crying and asking if the baby was okay, if it was alive, and I told her yes while staring at the impossibly small person in my arms. The baby had my sister's nose and my mother's chin. A girl, I realized, when I adjusted the towel around her body. The ambulance finally arrived 20 minutes after the baby was born. The paramedics came rushing in with bags of equipment, looking startled when they saw the baby already delivered and cleaned up. One of them asked if I'd cut the cord, and I said no. I didn't know how. They clamped it in 2 places and cut between them with surgical scissors, separating my niece from my sister with 3 quick snips. They examined the baby under bright lights, checking her airways and listening to her heart, pronouncing her healthy despite the circumstances. 7 pounds, 3 ounces, perfectly formed and crying with impressive lung capacity. They loaded Naomi onto a stretcher and took her to the hospital with the baby wrapped in heated blankets. I rode in the ambulance with them, watching paramedics take my sister's vitals and ask questions about her medical history that neither of us could answer. At the hospital, nurses swarmed around Naomi and the baby, wheeling them into different rooms while someone handed me paperwork to fill out. I didn't know basic information like Naomi's blood type or whether she was allergic to medications. I couldn't answer questions about prenatal vitamins or ultrasounds or anything else that normal pregnancies involved. I just kept writing unknown in blank spaces until a nurse took the clipboard away and told me to wait in the hallway. I called my parents from the hospital waiting room. My mother answered on the 3rd ring, sounding annoyed that I was bothering her at work. I said Naomi had given birth and they needed to come to the hospital right away. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then my mother laughed, actually laughed, and said I wasn't funny and she didn't appreciate me pulling pranks. When I insisted this was real, that Naomi had delivered a baby girl on our bathroom floor and was currently being examined by doctors, my mother's voice went cold. She said I was lying just like Naomi had been lying for months, and she'd deal with both of us when she got home. My father's reaction was worse when my mother called him. I could hear him shouting through the phone, his voice loud enough that my mother held the phone away from her ear. He was furious that we were still pushing this ridiculous story, that we were now involving hospitals and wasting emergency services with our attention-seeking behavior. My mother tried to calm him down, but he just got angrier, saying he was done with this nonsense and he wasn't leaving work for another fake crisis. My mother agreed with him. She told me to stop playing games and go home immediately. Then she hung up. A social worker came to talk to me about an hour later. Her name was Diane, and she had kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. She sat down next to me in the waiting room and asked about my family situation in a gentle voice that made me want to cry. I explained everything as clearly as I could. How Naomi had been obviously pregnant for months, but our parents refused to acknowledge it. How they'd pulled her out of school and kept her isolated at home. How they'd denied her medical care and called her a liar every time she brought it up. How I'd delivered my niece on our bathroom floor because the ambulance took too long and our parents wouldn't come even when I called them from the hospital. Diane wrote everything down in a notebook, asking clarifying questions and nodding sympathetically. She told me Naomi and the baby were both healthy, which was miraculous given the circumstances. No prenatal care meant no way to monitor for complications, no ultrasounds to check the baby's position, no tests for genetic conditions or developmental issues. Naomi could have died giving birth at home without medical assistance. The baby could have had problems that went undetected until it was too late. They were both incredibly lucky. Then Diane told me she'd called Child Protective Services. Because of Naomi's age and the complete lack of prenatal care, CPS needed to investigate our home situation. A caseworker would be assigned to evaluate whether our parents were fit guardians, whether Naomi and I were safe, whether the baby could go home with us or needed to be placed in foster care temporarily. Diane explained this gently but firmly, making it clear this wasn't optional or negotiable. The state had an obligation to protect vulnerable children, and right now that included Naomi, the baby, and me. My parents finally arrived at the hospital 3 hours later. They stormed through the emergency room doors looking furious, demanding to know where their daughters were and what kind of stunt we were pulling. A nurse tried to direct them to Naomi's room, but they pushed past her, following signs until they found the maternity ward. I heard my father's voice echoing down the hallway before I saw him, shouting about lies and manipulation and how his family was being humiliated. When my parents saw Naomi lying in a hospital bed holding a newborn baby, they both froze. My mother's face went through several expressions at once, confusion and shock and something that might have been horror. My father just stared, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Naomi looked at them with exhausted eyes and said quietly that she'd tried to tell them. She'd been trying to tell them for 9 months. Now here was the proof they couldn't deny anymore. My mother started crying, these strange gasping sobs that didn't sound real. She kept saying no over and over, shaking her head like she could make reality disappear through sheer denial. My father's face turned red and he started shouting again, not at Naomi but at the hospital staff. He demanded to know who was responsible for this situation, who had been feeding his daughter lies, who had convinced her to go along with this elaborate hoax. He refused to believe the baby was real even when nurses showed him the birth certificate paperwork and medical records documenting the delivery. That's when Diane stepped in with hospital security behind her. She introduced herself as the social worker assigned to this case and calmly informed my parents that CPS had been notified. Because they'd denied their pregnant teenage daughter medical care for 9 months, there would be an investigation into their fitness as guardians. They would not be taking Naomi or the baby home tonight. Instead, Naomi would remain in the hospital for observation, and the baby would stay with her under medical supervision until CPS completed their initial assessment. My father exploded. He shouted that this was his family and nobody had the right to interfere. He accused the hospital of kidnapping his children and threatened to call the police. Diane remained completely calm, explaining that she had already coordinated with law enforcement and they were aware of the situation. If my father continued to be disruptive, security would escort him from the premises. The choice was his. He could either cooperate with the investigation, or he could leave immediately and wait to hear from CPS through official channels. My mother pulled my father's arm, begging him to calm down before he made things worse. He jerked away from her and stormed out of the maternity ward, his footsteps thundering down the hallway. My mother looked between Naomi and me with wet eyes, opening her mouth like she wanted to say something, then following my father without speaking. The silence after they left felt heavy and strange. Naomi stared at the doorway where our parents had disappeared, tears sliding down her cheeks, while the baby slept peacefully in her arms. Diane arranged for me to stay at the hospital overnight. They set up a cot in Naomi's room so I could be with her and the baby, who still didn't have a name yet. Naomi was too exhausted and overwhelmed to think about names. She just held the baby and cried quietly while nurses came and went, checking vitals and bringing bottles of formula since Naomi's milk hadn't come in yet. I helped change the baby's first diaper, fumbling with the tiny tabs and trying not to wake her when she started fussing. Neither of us knew what we were doing, but we figured it out together. The CPS caseworker came the next morning. Her name was Leslie, and she had a professional but warm demeanor that put me slightly at ease. She interviewed Naomi first, asking detailed questions about her pregnancy and our parents' response to it. Naomi explained how she'd realized she was pregnant around week 12, when her period didn't come for the third month in a row. She'd taken 3 drugstore pregnancy tests that all came back positive. When she showed our parents the positive tests, our father ripped them up and said she was trying to ruin the family's reputation. Naomi described the next 6 months in painful detail, how our parents forbade her from seeing a doctor, claiming doctors would just enable her lies, how they removed her from school in her sophomore year, telling administrators she was being homeschooled due to anxiety issues, how they monitored her internet usage to prevent her from looking up pregnancy information or reaching out for help, how they restricted her diet supposedly for her health, not realizing she needed extra nutrition for the growing baby, how they told her repeatedly that she was making up the pregnancy for attention, and if she just admitted she was lying, everything would go back to normal. Leslie took notes and asked about the baby's father. Naomi's face went carefully blank when she said she couldn't talk about that. Leslie pressed gently, explaining that knowing the father's identity was important for legal and medical reasons. Naomi just shook her head and said she couldn't. She just couldn't, and started crying again. Leslie didn't push further in that moment, but made a note that the subject needed to be revisited later. She moved on to asking about me, about our home environment, about whether there were other adults who could provide support. When Leslie interviewed me separately, I tried to be as honest as possible about our family dynamics. Our parents had always been strict and controlling, but they'd gotten worse over the past year. They monitored everything we did, checked our phones constantly, didn't allow us to have friends over or attend social events. They'd become obsessed with reputation and appearances, constantly worried about what neighbors and relatives thought of us. When Naomi got pregnant, it was like their worst nightmare came true. So they just decided it wasn't real, and demanded everyone else play along with that fiction. Leslie asked if our parents had ever been physically violent. I hesitated before admitting that our father had a temper and sometimes grabbed us roughly or shoved us when he was angry. Nothing that left visible bruises, nothing I would have called abuse before all this happened. But looking back now through Leslie's professional scrutiny, I realized maybe it had been worse than I acknowledged. Leslie wrote extensive notes and told me she appreciated my honesty. She explained the investigation would take several weeks, and during that time, Naomi and the baby would be placed in a temporary foster home equipped to handle teen mothers with newborns. The foster home was run by a woman named Beverly, who specialized in helping young mothers. She had a large house with several bedrooms, a nursery full of donated baby supplies, and 2 other teen girls currently staying there with their infants. Beverly welcomed Naomi with a warm hug and showed her to a sunny room on the 2nd floor that would be hers for as long as she needed it. The room had a crib next to the bed, a changing table stocked with diapers and wipes, and a rocking chair by the window. Beverly explained her house rules calmly and kindly, emphasizing that this was a safe space for Naomi to learn how to be a mother without judgment. I had to go home. As much as I wanted to stay with Naomi and the baby, Leslie explained I couldn't live at Beverly's house because I wasn't a teen parent. I needed to return home while CPS completed their investigation, which meant facing my parents alone. The drive home was the longest 20 minutes of my life. I kept thinking about what I'd say when I walked through the door, how I'd explain where I'd been, whether they'd even let me in the house. My parents were waiting in the living room when I arrived. They sat on opposite ends of the couch, not touching, their faces carved from stone. My father told me to sit down, and I obeyed, perching on the edge of the armchair across from them. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then my father asked in a controlled voice where Naomi was. I said she was at a foster home with the baby, that CPS had placed her there temporarily during the investigation. My mother made a choked sound and covered her face with her hands. My father's control cracked. He started shouting about how I'd destroyed our family, how I'd betrayed them by calling 911 and involving authorities. If I'd just kept quiet, none of this would have happened. They could have handled it privately, made appropriate arrangements, preserved some dignity. Instead, I'd called strangers who had no business interfering with family matters. Now everyone would know their private shame. Neighbors would gossip, relatives would judge. Our reputation was ruined because I couldn't mind my own business. I felt something shift inside me as I listened to my father rant. This wasn't about Naomi's well-being or the baby's health. This was about appearances and control and their inability to accept reality when it didn't match their preferred narrative. I interrupted my father mid-sentence, my voice shaking but firm. I told him Naomi could have died giving birth on our bathroom floor. The baby could have had complications that went untreated. They'd denied their pregnant teenage daughter medical care for 9 months because they cared more about reputation than her life. That wasn't love. That wasn't protection. That was neglect. My father stood up so fast the couch rocked. He took 2 steps toward me and I flinched, genuinely afraid he might hit me. My mother grabbed his arm and pulled him back, begging him to calm down. He stood there breathing hard, fists clenched at his sides, glaring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Pure rage mixed with something that looked almost like grief. Then he turned and walked out of the room. I heard his footsteps on the stairs, heard the bedroom door slam. My mother and I sat in silence. After several minutes, my mother spoke in a barely audible whisper. She asked if I really believed they'd been neglectful. I looked at her tear-stained face and said yes, I did. She'd watched her teenage daughter's body change for 9 months, seen her get morning sickness and develop a visible pregnant belly, heard her beg for medical help, and she'd done nothing except insist it wasn't real. That was worse than doing nothing. That was active denial in the face of obvious truth. My mother started crying harder, saying she didn't know what was wrong with her, why she couldn't accept what was happening, how she'd convinced herself this couldn't be real because the alternative was too horrible to face. The CPS investigation dragged on for 6 weeks. During that time, I lived at home with my parents in tense silence. They barely spoke to me except when necessary. My father went to work and came home and disappeared into his office. My mother cooked meals that none of us ate properly, pushing food around plates while the television played unwatched shows. I visited Naomi at Beverly's house twice a week, watching my sister slowly transform into a mother. She learned how to breastfeed after the initial struggles, how to soothe the baby when she cried, how to change diapers with quick efficiency. She'd named the baby Iris, after our grandmother who'd passed away when we were young. Beverly taught Naomi practical skills our parents never had: how to budget money, how to apply for assistance programs, how to fill out paperwork for daycare and medical appointments. Beverly had connections with community resources and helped Naomi enroll in a program that would let her finish high school while caring for Iris. Other teen mothers at Beverly's house shared advice and babysat for each other, creating a support network Naomi desperately needed. For the first time in months, my sister smiled genuinely. She was exhausted and overwhelmed, but also determined and hopeful. Leslie came to our house multiple times during the investigation, interviewing my parents separately and together. She inspected our home, looked through our family photos, asked neighbors and relatives about our family dynamics. The picture that emerged was troubling, but not quite clear-cut. My parents had no history of reported abuse, no previous CPS involvement, no criminal records. They were seen as respectable community members with steady jobs and a well-maintained home. But they'd also demonstrated dangerous denial and neglect when confronted with Naomi's pregnancy, prioritizing their reputation over her health in ways that could have been fatal. The question CPS had to answer was whether my parents could be trusted with my continued care and whether they could ever rebuild a relationship with Naomi and Iris. Leslie explained this to me during one of her visits. She said the investigation would result in one of several outcomes. My parents could complete parenting classes and therapy to address their issues, with the goal of eventual reunification with Naomi. They could maintain their rights regarding me but lose custody of Naomi permanently. Or in the worst case, they could lose custody of both of us if the investigation revealed deeper problems. Around week 4 of the investigation, Naomi finally told Leslie about the baby's father. She'd been holding this secret close, terrified of the consequences. When she revealed the truth, Leslie's expression went from professional interest to shocked concern. The father was our youth pastor at church, a married man in his 30s named David Keller who'd been counseling Naomi during a difficult time. He'd groomed her over several months, convincing her their special relationship was blessed by God, that she was mature beyond her years, that what they shared was sacred and needed to stay secret. When Naomi got pregnant, David told her to keep quiet or he'd lose his ministry and his marriage, and it would be her fault for tempting him. Leslie immediately contacted the police. What David had done wasn't just morally wrong. It was statutory rape. A youth pastor in a position of power and trust had sexually abused a teenage girl in his care. The fact that the abuse resulted in pregnancy meant there was biological evidence that could prove what happened. Within 24 hours, detectives were interviewing Naomi, collecting her detailed statement, explaining they'd need DNA from the baby and David to build their case. Naomi was terrified but also relieved to finally tell someone what had really happened. The arrest happened during Sunday service. Detectives waited until David finished his sermon and stepped down from the pulpit before approaching him in front of the entire congregation. They announced they had a warrant for his arrest on charges of statutory rape and sexual abuse of a minor. The sanctuary erupted in shocked gasps and confused chatter as detectives handcuffed David and read him his rights. His wife screamed and tried to grab his arm. Church members demanded to know what was happening. David just stood there with his head down, not denying anything, not resisting. News of the arrest spread through our community like wildfire. By Monday morning, everyone knew David Keller had been arrested for abusing a teenage girl in his congregation and getting her pregnant. People quickly figured out the girl was Naomi when she suddenly disappeared from church months ago. Some community members blamed Naomi, saying she must have seduced him, that teenage girls these days dressed provocatively and led men astray. But others were horrified and supportive, recognizing that a man in his 30s who held spiritual authority over vulnerable teenagers was entirely responsible for his actions. The backlash against my parents intensified. People pointed out that Naomi had tried to tell them she was pregnant, that she'd begged for help, and they'd called her a liar instead of protecting her. If they'd listened, if they'd gotten her medical care, if they'd asked the right questions, David might have been caught months earlier. Instead, their denial had enabled his abuse to stay hidden, had endangered Naomi's life, and had resulted in a traumatic home birth. Community opinion turned sharply against them. Former friends stopped returning their calls. My father's boss suggested he take extended leave from work to deal with his family situation. Our house became a prison of shame. The trial happened faster than anyone expected because David's lawyer advised him to take a plea deal. With DNA evidence proving he was Iris's father, witness testimony from Naomi about the grooming process, and corroborating statements from other youth group members who'd noticed inappropriate attention, the case against him was overwhelming. David pleaded guilty to statutory rape, sexual abuse of a minor, and child endangerment. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in prison with no possibility of parole for at least 10. His wife filed for divorce before he was transferred to state prison. At David's sentencing hearing, Naomi gave a victim impact statement. She stood at the podium holding a paper she'd written, her voice shaking but determined. She described how David had befriended her when she was 14 and going through a rough time, how he'd told her she was special, mature, chosen by God, how he'd slowly isolated her from peers and family, making her dependent on his approval and attention, how he'd convinced her their sexual relationship was sacred when really he was just raping a child, how when she got pregnant, he'd threatened her into silence, more concerned about his reputation than her well-being. She ended by saying she forgave him because that's what she needed to do to heal, but she hoped he spent every day in prison thinking about how he'd destroyed her childhood and his own life through his selfish choices. The CPS investigation concluded shortly after David's sentencing. Leslie delivered the findings in a meeting with my parents, their lawyer, and a court-appointed advocate for Naomi and me. The report stated my parents had demonstrated severe neglect by denying Naomi medical care during pregnancy despite obvious evidence. They'd failed to protect her from abuse by not asking appropriate questions about how she became pregnant. Their response to the crisis had been more focused on appearances than their daughter's safety. However, the report also noted they had no prior history of abuse and appeared genuinely remorseful once forced to confront reality. The court's decision was complicated. My parents would retain custody of me with supervision, required to attend family therapy and parenting classes for 6 months. They would complete courses on recognizing signs of abuse and appropriate responses to crisis situations. A caseworker would check on me monthly to ensure I was safe and properly cared for. Regarding Naomi, she could choose whether to return home or remain in foster care until she turned 18. The decision was entirely hers. My parents could have supervised visits with Iris, but no unsupervised contact for at least 1 year, contingent on them completing their required programs and demonstrating changed behavior. Naomi chose to stay at Beverly's house. She explained to my parents during a supervised visit that she couldn't trust them anymore, couldn't feel safe in a home where they'd ignored her cries for help. She needed space to figure out who she was as a mother and person, separate from their expectations and denial. My mother cried and apologized repeatedly. My father sat silent, his face gray and aged. They didn't fight Naomi's decision. Maybe they finally understood the consequences of their actions, or maybe they were just too defeated to argue. Life slowly found a new normal over the following months. I lived at home but spent most of my time at Beverly's house helping Naomi with Iris. My parents attended their required therapy and classes without complaint. In family therapy sessions, they talked about their obsession with appearances, their inability to handle imperfection, their deep shame that had manifested as denial. The therapist helped them understand that real love meant accepting difficult truths and supporting your children through crises, not pretending problems didn't exist because acknowledging them felt too painful. Naomi finished her sophomore year through the teen parent program and started her junior year the following fall. Beverly babysat Iris while Naomi attended classes. Other teen mothers in the program became Naomi's friend group, girls who understood her situation without judgment. She started talking about college eventually, maybe studying social work to help other young mothers. Watching her make plans for the future despite everything she'd been through made me incredibly proud of my sister's strength. The supervised visits between my parents and Naomi remained awkward but gradually improved. My mother learned to hold Iris properly, to help with feedings, to change diapers without complaining. My father mostly just watched from across the room, occasionally making stilted comments about how big Iris was getting. Naomi was polite but distant, willing to let them be grandparents in limited capacity but not ready to forgive or forget. I didn't blame her. Trust, once shattered so completely, takes years to rebuild if it can be rebuilt at all. 2 years later, Naomi graduated high school with honors while 7 months pregnant again. Not from another assault, but from a relationship with another young father at Beverly's house who'd been placed there with his daughter after his own parents kicked him out. They'd bonded over late-night feedings and shared struggles, eventually falling in love in that specific way people do when they survive trauma together. I watched Naomi walk across the graduation stage holding Iris on her hip, her pregnant belly visible under her graduation gown, and felt overwhelming pride mixed with lingering sadness for everything she'd lost. My parents attended the graduation sitting in the back row. They'd completed all their required programs and therapy. The caseworker's supervision had ended after 18 months with positive reports. My mother had started volunteering with a pregnancy resource center, helping teenagers access prenatal care regardless of their family situations. My father had joined a men's group at a different church focused on healthy masculinity and emotional awareness. They were trying to be better people, better parents, though the damage they'd caused couldn't be fully undone. Naomi moved into her own apartment after graduation, supported by housing assistance and her job at a childcare center where she worked while taking online college courses. She allowed my parents to babysit Iris occasionally, always supervised by me initially, then eventually trusting them alone for short periods. The relationship would never be what it once was, but it existed in some form. That seemed like the best possible outcome given everything that had happened. I think about that day on the bathroom floor often. The moment I realized I was delivering my niece while my sister screamed in pain, and our parents refused to believe any of it was real. How close we came to tragedy because denial felt safer than truth. Sometimes I wake up from nightmares where the baby doesn't cry, where the ambulance never comes, where I'm 14 years old again and completely helpless. But then I visit Naomi's apartment and see her thriving despite everything. See Iris growing into a bright, loving child who'll never know the denial her mother faced. That makes the nightmares worth surviving. The teen pregnancy that surprised everyone wasn't really about the pregnancy itself. It was about how desperately my parents wanted to believe it wasn't happening, even when the evidence was undeniable. They chose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truth until reality forced itself into undeniable existence on a bathroom floor. By then, the damage was done, trust destroyed, and a family fractured in ways that would take a lifetime to heal. But we survived. Naomi survived, Iris survived, and sometimes survival is the most surprising outcome of all. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.